Welcome back to the swamp, my friends, and welcome if you're new. Today's video will be taking a journey into the depths of the wilderness where the silence is only broken by the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and the occasional hoot of an owl. These forests are often beautiful and serene, but they can also be the setting for some of the most terrifying and mysterious encounters. From unexplainable sightings and strange occurrences to ominous legends that have been passed down for generations, we've collected some of the most chilling and spine-tingling tales from the depths of the state forest all across this country. So, sit back and prepare to be scared as we delve into the mysteries of state forest horror stories. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. Remote Forest Camping Gone Wrong by Philbot78. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air as I stepped out of my car and gazed up at the towering trees that surrounded me. The state forest was vast and remote, but I had always been drawn to the quiet solitude of nature, and so I decided to spend the next few days camping alone in the heart of the forest. I set up my tent in a small clearing and started a fire, feeling a sense of accomplishment as I watched the flames dance and flicker in the darkness. But as the night grew colder, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept up on me. It was as if something was watching me from the darkness beyond the flickering light of the fire. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like footsteps padding softly through the leaves. My heart racing, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. But there was nothing there, just the trees, the darkness, and the oppressive silence of the forest. I returned to my tent and tried to settle back down to sleep, but my mind was racing with fear and paranoia. Then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps getting closer. I jumped up and shone my flashlight outside, but once again there was nothing there. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I retreated back into the tent and zipped it shut, hoping to keep whatever was out there lurking in the darkness at bay. But as the night wore on, the sounds continuously grew louder and more persistent. The footsteps turned to scratching and tapping against the sides of my tent, and I could hear something breathing heavily just outside. I was trapped, alone in the middle of the forest with no one to help me, and whatever was out there, it was getting closer and closer by the minute. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, I emerged from my tent, exhausted and absolutely terrified. And that's when I saw it. A twisted, gnarled figure lurking in the shadows just beyond the trees. Its eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, and its twisted limbs moved with an unnatural grace. I tried to run, but my legs were heavy and uncooperative. The figure was getting closer and closer, and I knew that I was doomed. But suddenly, I woke up, right as it was about to pounce. I was drenched in sweat. My heart was pounding in my chest. It had all just been a nightmare. At least, I was hoping that it was. But as I looked out in the quiet darkness of the forest, I couldn't shake that feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Luckily, nothing ever did. The next morning, I got up, calmly packed my stuff, and hiked on out of there. I don't know what happened to me. I'm sure it could have just been night terrors, but it seems like there was something a little bit more to it. The Redwoods Hide Monsters by Jericah M. I took a deep breath and stepped out of my car, feeling the warm air of the summer against my skin. The Redwood State Forest was said to be one of the most beautiful forests in the entire planet, and I had been looking forward to this day trip for quite some time, as work had been very busy. The sun was just starting to rise, casting an eerie glow over the trees. I grabbed my backpack and started hiking down the trail. The crunch of the leaves beneath my boots echoing through the forest were like therapy. The trees were tall and thick, their branches stretching up to the sky like skeletal fingers. I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine as I made my way deeper into the woods. As the day wore on, the forest grew darker and more foreboding. The birdsong had died down, and the only sound was the rustle of the leaves and the occasional snapping of a twig underfoot. I was beginning to feel uneasy, but I pressed on anyway, eager to see what lay ahead. That's when I started to see something. A figure standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. It was hard to make out any features, but I could tell it was humanoid. I called out, but there was no response. The figure just stood there, watching me. I started to feel a creeping sense of dread, and I quickened my pace, hoping to put some distance between myself and this mysterious figure. But as I walked, I realized that I was going in circles. The same trees, the same rocks, the same everything kept appearing no matter which direction I went. That's when the whispering started. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the leaves, but it grew louder and more insistent. I couldn't make out any of the words, but they sounded like a warning. I tried to ignore it, to push on, but my fear was overwhelming at this point. I turned a corner, and there it was again, the figure just standing ahead of me. This time it was much closer, and I could see that it was wearing a tattered cloak that fluttered in the wind. Its face was obscured by the hood, but I could make sense of its malevolence. I backed away, but it started to advance towards me, its footsteps slow and deliberate. I turned, ran, my heart pounding in my chest, but no matter how fast I went, the figure kept pace, always just out of sight. Eventually I stumbled and fell to the ground, my breath coming in a ragged gasp. I looked up, and there it was, looming over me. The hood fell back, revealing a face that was twisted into a grotesque grin. It reached out a bony hand, and it knew that I was lost. I know it did. I woke up hours later, lying on the ground in a clearing. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the trees. I got up and stumbled back to my car, my mind racing with terror. I never went back to the redwoods, but I could never forget that feeling of being hunted by something that was not of this world. I don't know why it didn't kill me. Maybe it just wanted to track me down, but for whatever reason, I'm glad to be alive.
Nothing could have prepared me for what happened. Not the hundreds of hours of classroom learning. All the practical training exercises in the world were for nothing. A squadron of fighter jets may have stood a chance, but I doubt it. What I encountered 6 years ago was an unstoppable force of nature, like a tsunami or a volcano eruption. If you're caught in its path, you're dead. Lucky for me, I survived. It was sheer luck that I did. This is a warning. Stay out of Yosemite National Park. 6 years ago, I was a mounted patrol ranger. On that day, Buckley, my Mustang stallion, and I were on patrol near Tulum Meadows when I noticed a man approaching us in the distance. He waved his arms at us frantically and collapsed to the ground. He clutched his chest and struggled to catch his breath. His mouth was wide open as he gasped for air. I thought he might have been having an asthma attack and kicked Buckley into a sprint. As we came closer, I immediately noticed blood on his shirt, but he didn't appear to be wounded. He cried out for help as I jumped off Buckley and went to see if there was anything I could do while I radioed for medical assistance. Before he could catch his breath, the man incoherently told me something about his son being injured and something about a tour group. I told him to concentrate on catching his breath so he could tell me what was happening more clearly. Once he was able to speak, he introduced himself as Greg. He told me what happened with his tour group. Honestly, I couldn't believe it until I experienced it for myself. He said they'd been on a guided tour in the woods nearby, and everything was fine until there were a series of explosions among the tour group. Greg said his son's cell phone had exploded in his pocket, and his wife's digital camera had blown to pieces inside the carrying case. All of their electronic devices had blown up, including the tour guide's radio. He also mentioned that a man had collapsed on the spot and remained unresponsive. Of course, his main concern was for his son. He said shards from the foam were lodged in his leg, and he suffered burns. They tried to tend to the wounds before he came running for help. I relayed the information back to the base, requesting medical assistance on my position once Greg led me back to the injured group. While I didn't like to ride double on Buckley, time was of the essence. Greg was far too exhausted to allow him to continue on foot. The tour group could not have been too far away if he had made it to me. Buckley could handle the weight, and we needed to get there as soon as possible. He likely would have died of a heart attack if I didn't give him a ride. Perhaps that would have been a mercy compared to how he died later on. We rode alongside the stream, heading directly to the tree line in the distance. The path was familiar, as it was a popular destination for a moderate hike. Greg showed me where to go. As we came closer to the trees, I felt a rising warmth on my side. Remembering what Greg told me earlier about the electronics, I immediately reached down and removed the radio from my holster. It felt like it had been under the sun for hours. It was so damned hot. It burned the palm of my hand, and I dropped it to the side. Upon hitting the ground, it sparked before it exploded. Buckley got startled at the sound and bucked. I comforted him as best as I could while charging ahead. The further into the woods we went, Buckley became more agitated. He bucked hard, nearly tossing Greg and me off of him. It wasn't like Buckley to not follow commands. He had been trained for the service since he was a colt. The further I tried to force him to continue, the more he fought until I decided to leave him behind. Buckley fought like crazy when I tried to tie him to a tree. There wasn't much I could do against a 3,500-pound horse. If he wanted to leave, he was going to leave. In a last-ditch effort, I tried to pull him and the rein slipped from my hand. Buckley turned back in the direction we had come from and disappeared into the woods. He'd probably ran back all the way to the stable like he was trained to do. Admittedly, this left me feeling a bit shaken. As we trekked through the woods, Greg asked if I had any idea what was happening, and I didn't really have an answer for him. Buckley getting spooked, I could understand, something unnerved him. Something which Greg and I couldn't sense. But he could feel from the moment we entered those woods, exploding electronics was not something we were taught about in training. As I said earlier, nothing in the world could have prepared me for what came that day. Nothing. When I made myself known, I was immediately ambushed by several tourists. They all spoke at once requesting help for their loved ones. Being swarmed by everyone asking questions and asking for assistance did not help with the situation at all. From what I could see, most of the injured sustained burns and lacerations were probably not life-threatening. What really worried me was the unresponsive man Greg mentioned earlier. Through the crowd, I saw a woman sitting off to the side with a 1,000-yard stare in her eyes. She sat against a tree, alone next to a heavy-set man face down on the ground. I insisted on attending the man who clearly wasn't recovering or moving or showing any signs of life. From what I could tell, he wasn't even breathing. I ran over to the man and checked for a pulse while asking his companion if she felt okay. She didn't respond, and I could see why. There was no pulse. The man was dead. Falling back on my training, I immediately went and started the chest compressions. I reached underneath the man's side to flip him over, and my hands were immediately met with warmth and wetness. When I turned him over, I immediately jumped in surprise. My hands were covered in blood. There was a hole in the man's chest where his heart would have been if it hadn't exploded. I saw pieces of wire and metal surrounding the mangled meat of the wound. At the confirmation that her companion was indeed dead, the woman wailed so loudly everyone turned their attention to her. Between her sobs and scream, she only said one word, which I understood. Pacemaker. Seeing there was a casualty, I called out for someone to hand me something to cover the deceased face. No one moved or made a noise aside from the woman grieving her dead companion. It was here I noticed the absolute silence surrounding us. Usually, there are signs of life all around us making noises. Birds chirping, bugs buzzing, frogs croaking. It was at that moment I realized we were in danger, more than we knew. It was silent around us because the animals had either run away like Buckley had, or they remained silent to hide from what scared them. Whatever was happening, I needed everyone to get out of the woods quickly. I commanded the non-injured to assist the wounded and help them start walking out of the woods. One of the women in the group asked why I didn't just radio for help. I told her my radio had blown up and we needed to get out of here as fast as possible. Now, if you've ever done anything in life with a group of people, you'll understand that getting them to follow directions is damned near impossible. One person wants to fight back on anything you tell them because they don't respect authority. Another person yells at the person to comply. Those two start a fight. You have another person who starts doing their own thing. You have others following them. Groups split off into other groups and, it kind of just becomes a big mess. In this case, we didn't even get the chance to start fighting each other. As I tried to get everyone moving, a blast of lightning ripped across the blackening sky above us. It struck a tree only a few hundred yards away. Then the wind picked up, lifting leaves and dust and debris through the air. The weather report for the week was clear, sunny skies with no chance of precipitation. This development unnerved me as I looked up to the clouds overhead and saw how deeply dark and ominous and out of place and alien these clouds were in the sky. Buried somewhere within the primitive part of my brain, I recognized something was amiss in this isolated pocket of our world. It must have hit the others in the group as well, as some of them stopped and stared into the sky, petrified and frozen in place, awaiting their demise. Others rushed to grab their loved ones and drag them to safety. Still, others just abandoned the group in utter terror with nothing but instinct of self-preservation dominating the otherwise civilized and evolved parts of their being. What came next, I still see it whenever it storms. First, another eruption of lightning tore the sky asunder, nearly deafening me with its turbulent force. Then, in the electrical firebolts streaking across the sky, I saw the silhouette of a massive winged creature flying through the air. With each thrust of its colossal wings, it produced bolts of lightning crackling across the sky in all directions. I was glued to the spot, staring up at it through the tops of the trees and branches in awe. As the creature circled the sky above, with each flash and crackle of lightning, the sky filled with smaller versions of the beast surrounding their brood mother. It was at this moment I realized that this is what had spooked Buckley and all the other animals. They knew this creature was coming and ran for their lives. Our exploding electronics were our warning. Nothing as deep-seated as animal instinct, but a warning nonetheless. After witnessing this, I am ashamed to admit that I gave in to the part of me hell-bent on self-preservation and started to run away from the woods. But unfortunately, many others had already been running away, leaving behind those who tried to help their injured friends and family. If I had tried to help anyone at this point, I would have likely joined them in death. As I ran into the woods, I saw someone running in front of me rise into the air as if the invisible hand of God plucked them from the ground. There wasn't any time to process what I had just seen. I felt a sudden lurch beneath my feet, and I too was airborne. My first crazed thought was to assume one of those creatures had swept me off the ground. However, as the world spun, I realized nothing was holding on to me. Instinctively, I reached out and tried to take hold of a tree branch, but I couldn't get a grasp as they slipped through my hands, and I went further into the air. This happened at least a dozen more times until I finally grabbed hold tightly to a branch and managed to pull myself to the trunk. I still felt the force of being pulled upward as I held on and didn't let go until the whole thing was over and the creatures were gone. But I'm jumping ahead here. From my position, I had a clear view of what was happening. Unfortunately, the others hadn't been as lucky as I was. They continued to float into the air, spinning around, screaming, and reaching out like a doomed astronaut, untethered and floating into the vastness of outer space. It wasn't only other people either. There were deer, birds, and several other animals caught in the same trap. All of them floated through the air, high above the trees, and stopped their heavenly ascent at the same point. With one final screech from their brood mother, the smaller creatures circled through the air once and swooped down to enjoy their meal. Humans, animals, insects, whatever managed to float to that invisible line in the sky was consumed. The sound of their screeches and squawks masked the screams. I turned my head away, holding it against the tree, and tightening my grip on the tree trunk for dear life. I didn't know if these creatures would notice one of their snacks had gone missing. Maybe they'd sweep down into the trees and I'd be done for. But of course they didn't. I cannot guess for how long I stayed in the tree, but once the screeches and squawks stopped, I no longer heard any screams, and gravity felt as if it had returned, and I braved a look to the sky. It was clear of any monsters or dark clouds. Nothing or no one floated in the air against the laws of gravity. The setting sun of dusk returned to its rightful place, dominating the sky and extinguishing the last remnants of the light in the day. All had returned to normal, except for my state of mind. I climbed down the tree, slowly and steadily as my muscles ached. Once I reached the ground, I sat down and allowed myself to rest. My mind was reeling. My body was thrashed. I closed my eyes for what felt like a minute, maybe just two, and awakened to a paramedic shaking me awake. Moments later, I was carted off in an ambulance and treated for my wounds. Of course, there were tons of questions as to what happened afterwards. The whole incident was chalked up to a random, freak tornado happening in the area, and the tour group was wiped out in the resulting storm. According to the authorities on the scene, there were dark clouds over the section of the woods and they saw a massive cone touch down. As far as I was concerned, I let them tell whatever story they wanted to make it all go away. It's not like anyone would believe me anyway. Not long after the incident, I decided to quit being a park ranger and moved to Philadelphia to live with some family for a while, before getting back on my feet again. I just couldn't stand the thought of being in the forest anymore, after seeing what I saw. So, when it storms, I run for cover indoors and stay away from windows. I drown myself in alcohol and take a few extra Xanax to avoid the inevitable thoughts which creep into my mind right before I go to sleep. But in my nightmares, I'm always back to Yosemite. Buckley and I on patrol, and we see Greg coming toward us in need of help.
This last story comes from a family member of mine who wanted to share their story, so I hope you enjoy it. Chased by a Feral Gang by Anonymous. The sun was setting as Jenna began her hike through the state forest. She had planned this trip for months, wanting to escape the chaos of the city and spend some time in nature. As she walked deeper into the forest, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. But that feeling was short-lived. She heard the sound of twigs snapping behind her and turned around to see a group of feral-looking people emerging from the trees. They were covered in dirt and leaves, and their eyes were weird and full of malice. Jenna's heart raced as she realized she was being chased. She ran as fast as she could, but the gang was relentless, their guttural screams echoing through the forest behind her. She could feel their hot breath on the back of her neck at certain points as she darted through the trees, her lungs burning with exhaustion. But no matter how hard she tried, she could not shake their pursuers. The gang was gaining on her, their twisted faces illuminated by the light of the moon. Jenna stumbled over a root and fell to the ground, her ankle throbbing in pain. She scrambled to her feet and looked around frantically for a place to hide. She saw a cave up ahead and made a run for it, hoping to find some refuge inside. As she entered the cave, Jenna realized that she had made a terrible mistake. The gang had cornered her, and there was no escape. Their eyes glinted in the darkness, and Jenna knew she was going to die. She closed her eyes and waited for the inevitable. But nothing happened. When she opened her eyes, to her surprise, the gang was gone. Jenna couldn't believe her luck and stumbled out of the cave, gasping for air. She made it back to civilization and reported the incident to the authorities, but they never found any evidence of the gang, and Jenna was left wondering if it had all been some sort of nightmare. Years later, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched every time she stepped into a forest, haunted by the memory of that terrifying night. Thanks for listening to these creepy and allegedly true state forest horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to slap that like button as it helps this video grow. Be sure to subscribe to The Swamp if you're new. Turn on notifications to never miss a new episode as I upload them almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, be sure to submit yours at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. You can also submit it via Reddit at r/thedarkswamp. I'd love to see your story and share it with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going on a daily basis. If you're on the go, but don't have YouTube Premium, but still want to download and listen to your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories no matter where you are, you can download them on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you find your favorite podcast online. It would be very helpful if you're listening on those platforms to give us a 5-star rating on those platforms, as it helps us grow there. Thank you guys, as always, for supporting the swamp the way you do. I couldn't do this on a daily basis without you all. I'll see you all soon with another creepy episode, and be sure to comment the code word leaping elephant to confuse anybody who didn't make it to the end.